Good afternoon. Before we get started, I have a very quick announcement. Several of you already have flyers. This Sunday is the community-wide commemoration of the Holocaust called Yom HaShoah. There is a commemorative event at the Friedman Center from 2 to 4 p.m. It will be focusing on people's creative responses to the Holocaust, 4 very interesting speakers, wonderful music, a candle lighting ceremony. It's a very moving experience. We also have a unique opportunity for students who may be attending to be able to escort some of our survivors, including our survivor speaker today, for the candle lighting. If anybody has any questions or might be available to be an escort on Sunday afternoon, would you please see me afterward? I'm Barbara Lesh McCaffrey. I'm president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, which helps to underwrite the lecture series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. We're 71 years away this week from the liberation of Dachau. And I always think it appropriate as this semester winds to its close that we return to the reason this lecture series was created, the Holocaust. It's gotten to be the case that this year we have fewer and fewer survivors who can come and give testimony, who can tell us about their experience. I'm very glad that we still have Hans, and he is here to speak with you today. Hans Angress was born in Berlin on April 14th, 1928, to Ernst and Henny, and had 2 older brothers, Tom and Fred. Hans's family was what he describes as a typical upper middle class German Jewish family. His father a banker, his mother a homemaker. Hans survived the war in Amsterdam. He was in hiding for 18 months with the family Koi. His mother Henny and his older brother Fred also survived in hiding. His oldest brother, Tom, had previously emigrated to the United States in 1939, and he served as an interrogator of prisoners of war in the 82nd Airborne Division. His father, Ernst, perished in Auschwitz. Hans is one of the pillars of this lecture series, and he has long been an active member of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. It's very important that his story and his message reach as broad an audience as possible, and Hans has dedicated himself to that mission. He speaks here every year. He speaks in many classrooms and meeting halls in Sonoma County, in California, and across the United States. We already know how valuable Hans's dedication to preserving this memory is, and now you're going to have the chance to hear his story as well. Please welcome Hans Angress.
I feel honored to be asked again this year to share my experience about growing up Jewish during the Nazi period in Germany and later on in occupied Holland, and to share with you what it felt like to be considered a surplus human being, to be eliminated, and how my mother, my brother Fred, and I managed to survive. One of the reasons I wish to share that experience was pointed out in an article published by the New York Times last September called "The Next Genocide." The article stated that in today's world, much of the same conditions exist as existed in Germany more than 75 years ago. Hitler felt that Germany did not have enough land to feed its people, and therefore planned to conquer enough land to feed his people, and therefore planned to eliminate the population of that country that he wished to conquer. Keep in mind that during my lifetime, world population tripled from 2.5 billion to over 7.5 billion. Now, if in the next 85 or 90 years, world population tripled again, heaven help us. I mean, look what is happening right now. We have all kinds of air pollution, water pollution, shortages of all kinds. So I think it's important to look at what might happen. I'll focus on my own experiences and that of my older brother Tom, who was 8 years older than I and who had experienced Germany for 13 years before Hitler came to power. I will touch briefly on Dr. Bruno Kitt, who selected my father to die in Auschwitz. I want to give you a bit of history to put things into perspective, even though most of you are probably aware of these facts. Germany had lost World War I, which it had started, and was in terrible financial shape. There was a worldwide economic depression, and Germany had to pay restitution to the victors of World War I, to the Allied. There was huge unemployment. The German people were desperate, and along came Hitler and his Nazi cohorts, promised the moon, and the Germans went for it. The Nazi leadership was convinced that Germanic, so-called Aryan, white, blonde, blue-eyed people are superior to all others and deserved to rule not only Germany but the world. They especially hated Jews, but also many others, like the Gypsies, whom we now call Romanos. Jehovah's Witnesses, because they refused to swear allegiance to Hitler. The Slavic Eastern European people. People with mental and physical disabilities, because they were a burden to the state. And many others, all of whom they considered not worthy of living. Initially, the Nazis tried to get rid of its Jews by making it impossible for them to earn a living in Germany, thereby encouraging to leave the country, and that actually resulted in half the German Jewish population surviving by leaving. Hitler himself, he was a narcissist if ever there was one. It was all about him. I consider him an evil, unfortunately very intelligent maniac. That is why he does not bother me as much as many Germans who blindly followed him. Most of them basically decent human beings who started doing terrible, evil acts. After this introduction, I will share with you what it was like for me growing up in Nazi Germany and later on in occupied Holland. My first experience was really when I started school, when I was 6 years old in 1934. Hitler was in power for 1 year, and already when my parents enrolled me in a regular public school, it was an all-boys school. My class were 52 boys, and I was the only Jewish kid in the class. Now this cone that I'm holding was filled with goodies, and it was meant to signify a sweet year ahead. Well, the year didn't turn out to be that sweet for me. Like I said already, 1 year after Hitler came to power, I was seated in the back of the class and a little bit separate from the other kids, as if I had a contagious disease. Now, the other kids were not nasty to me. They didn't spit in my face or called me dirty Jew. They simply didn't socialize with me. The reason probably is that most of the parents probably were not Nazis, but they didn't want to be called Jew lovers either. So they probably simply told their kids, leave that Angress kid alone. Because being called a Jew lover could hurt you professionally as well as socially. In the mornings, for instance, when we have assembly, we all gathered around the flagpole, and they hoisted the German flag and then the swastika, and all the kids stood there and singing the German national anthem and their arm in salute, the Nazi salute, and then the Horst Wessel lied, the Nazi song. And I was not allowed to sing and had to stand with my arm besides my held down. Of course, I didn't want to sing and I didn't want to give the Nazi salute, but I certainly stood out like a sore thumb. We lived in a busy street leading to the suburbs, and on Sunday morning my brother Fred and I liked to sit on the desk in front of the window, the desk of my father in front of the window, and watch what was going on down below. And besides the streetcars and bicycles and buses and so on, there came the brown shirts marching down the street, singing, wenn das Judenblut vom Messer spritzt, dann geht's noch mal so gut. When the Jewish blood squirts off the knife, things go twice as well. Well, I asked my parents, what's that all about? And my parents tried to calm me down and told them, well, that's their problem, that's not your problem. And unfortunately, it turned out to be my problem. My brother Tom, in the meantime, was already in high school and was made keenly aware that he was deemed different. Some of his fellow students were devout Nazis. Others tried to protect him. The same held true for his teachers. Some were Nazis, some were not. My parents talked to the principal of the school to ask whether it would not be better to transfer Tom to a Jewish school. And the principal assured him that as long as he was principal, Tom would be safe. Tom stayed at that school until 1936, but it was not easy for him. In 1934, Tom joined a Jewish youth organization, the Schwarze Fähnlein, loosely translated the Black Platoon, a Jewish response to the Hitler Youth. These Jewish kids had their own uniform, short corduroy blue pants and white shirts, and they felt very German. They felt that Germany was their fatherland and would remain their fatherland, and they naively, firmly believed that all they had to do was to prove to the new German Nazi government that in all their being, their thinking and their actions, they were German and would remain German. In response, they expected to be accepted into the broad front of German renewal. Well, that did not happen. I never did have positive feelings toward Germany in my youth, because I never consciously experienced Germany before Hitler. I was 5 years old when he came to power. After a while, we moved, and my parents enrolled me in a Jewish school. And in 1936, there was the Olympics in Berlin, and all the Jewish schools decided to have their own mini Olympics. And I was enrolled in the Josef Lehmann Schule, and I was too young to participate in the sports competition, but I was selected to carry the school placard. And keep this picture in mind, it comes back later on. We fled Germany in 1937. My father was a bank, and in 1937 the Germans decided that Jews could not be bankers anymore. And while Jews were encouraged to leave the country, they had to pay a fleeing tax, which amounted to, I think, approximately 3/4 of their capital to be left behind as a tax. Now, my father had the responsibility for a family of 5, and he wasn't about to leave his hard-earned money behind. So he hired a young woman who took his money and put it in a suitcase which had a double bottom and hauled it from Berlin to Amsterdam. And she had no problem getting across, and I think she got about 10% of the money she hauled across the border. We fled from Berlin through Holland to London and tried to get across the ocean to the United States or to South America. But it would have taken years to get a visa to any of the countries across the ocean. So my parents finally made the fateful decision to return to Holland and start a new business there, a lingerie business. Holland was one of the few countries that still accepted German Jewish refugees. The store was very successful, and we opened the second store in The Hague, and a third store was planned in Rotterdam, but that never came to pass because the Germans invaded Holland in 1940. I helped a little bit in the store. One of my jobs was putting price tag on panties, and I handled more panties than you can imagine. My fingers were always inspected. There had to be absolutely no hangnails or any of the sort. The 2 years that I lived in Holland, first I went to school where I was supposed to learn Dutch. Well, you can imagine a class of German Jewish refugee kids who were supposed to learn Dutch. Now, the teachers, of course, tried to do their best, but among us students, we kept on talking German. And I felt I didn't make enough progress and asked my father, please enroll me in a Dutch school and let me think or swim, which he finally did. And I was running around with the dictionary under my arm, and I managed to get B's and C's, and I was happy with it, and so were my parents. And I learned Dutch much faster than I would have otherwise. Those 2 years in Holland were my basically most normal years, except the very first few before Hitler came to power. I joined the Cub Scouts and later on the Boy Scouts, and did all the things that the kids in that age, 9, 10, 11 years old, were supposed to do. Let's see what the next page is. Here's a picture of my class on an outing to the zoo. And here you can see me carrying a goat next to my then girlfriend Hedda. And the people from Mercy High decided to have some fun with it and blew it up. And this is the two of us in 1993 when my wife Inola and I visited Holland, and I have stayed in touch with Hedda all these years. In 1936, coming back to my brother Tom, he had entered I don't know exactly what year, but entered an agricultural training center for non-Zionist Jewish kids called Großbresen. It was deemed correctly that there was no future for Jews in Germany, and that having an agricultural training, you could find work anywhere in this world. And that training made it possible for him to, in 1939, to come to the United States, because farmers got priority quotas. So he managed to come across. He farmed for a couple of years, and when the war broke out, he joined the army. He was trained, he was one of the Ritchie boys, because of course he was fluent in German, and was trained to be an interrogator of prisoners of war. A few days before D-Day, the 82nd Airborne Division asked for more interrogators, and he volunteered. So his first jump was into Normandy on D-Day. He got captured because he was dropped way behind the line, but fortunately liberated again 10 days later, and the Germans never found out that he was a German Jew, and then took part in the Battle of the Bulge and in liberating a concentration camp. The Nazis invaded Holland in May 1940. Initially, nothing much changed. Hitler had hoped that the Dutch, whom he also considered Aryans, would join him in his quest to conquer the world. Well, the Dutch hated the Nazis and the Germans, and being occupied by Germany. And so after a while, Hitler started making all kinds of restrictions on the Dutch, and especially on the Jewish Dutch population. In April 1941, my father was, well, this was my brother Tom. My father was arrested again because he took his money out of Germany. He was deemed to be a criminal, and so they arrested him. He got a year's sentence. While he was in prison, it was possible to communicate with him, but when his sentence was up, he was sent to a number of concentration camps, finally to Auschwitz, where he perished in January of 1943. We only got that information from the American Red Cross in 1994, and the date that he died. And only a couple of years ago, I found out many of the details. In the fall of 1941, Hitler also decided on when it was impossible to get rid of the Jews by forcing them out of the country, he decided the final solution would be to eliminate all 11 million Jews living in Europe. Also in 1941, all Jewish people were required to wear this gem. It could not be pinned on, it had to be sewn on. You had to wear it anywhere outside the home, in class, and for us boys it created a problem because in PE the boys only wore shorts. So what were we going to do this thing? We are not going to sew it on. So we decided to sew it on our gym shorts. But if you were ever caught and your ID showed that you were a Jew and you didn't wear the star, basically you were toast. Also at that time, Jews were not allowed to attend regular public schools, but they had to attend Jewish schools. Well, let me backtrack here for a minute. In January of 1942, the infamous Wannsee Conference would take, where 15 people gathered to figure out how to implement Hitler's edict to kill the 11 million Jews living in Europe. And I was familiar with this. Wannsee is both a lake and a little village. And my family vacationed often in that village, so I knew the area well. And these were the 15 people that gathered to figure out how are we going to kill 11 million people. I consider them sort of the board of directors of the of a Clark Pest Control. Only their job was not how to exterminate termites, but how to figure out how to kill 11 million Jews, which they did with typical Prussian efficiency. It took them only 90 minutes to come up with the idea of mass executions in gas chambers. These 15 people were mostly PhDs or high German military officers. Ultimately, they only managed to kill 6 million Jews, as well as 5 million others deemed unworthy of living. Visiting that place, well, I visited the place in the house in the Wannsee Conference and found this picture, which I showed you before, blown up. It was part of an exhibit in the Wannsee house of the Wannsee Conference, depicting Jewish life in Berlin, and it blew my mind to find that picture there. And they were glad to figure out who the heck that was, because they didn't know. Let's see. In 1941, I mentioned earlier, Jews were not allowed to attend normal public schools, but had to go to Jewish public schools. And that's when I was enrolled in the Joods Lyceum in Amsterdam. At the same time, Anne Frank was enrolled there. We were both freshmen, but we were on different tracks. She was a lycée and I was gymnasium. She was a 7 years course of study, and I was on a 6-year course of study. So we were both freshmen in the same school, but we didn't have the same teachers, so, or at least not in the same classes. The only interaction I really had with her was in the halls, and I remember her face, and we played volleyball together. And if I remember correctly, I don't think she was the greatest volleyball player, but she was a brainiac. There was a book written about the school called Absent, and the class lists survived. And it's not too clear, but here you can see my name is the first in the second grade, freshman and sophomore of the gymnasium division, and here is Anne Franks as a freshman in the lycée division. I'm only showing you this as a proof that I'm not just blowing hot air, that I actually did go to school with Anne Frank. Her family went into hiding after the first year, and my family only managed to stay afloat another year before we went into hiding. Of her class of 30, 11 survived. Of my class of 23, 12 survived. So in a way you could say that my class was luckier than her class. Only 50% of my class got murdered, while 75% of her class got murdered. That was still better than the overall, 66% of her class got murdered, while 75% of the Dutch Jewish population didn't survive. For a short while, when we went to school, we were still allowed to bicycle and use public transportation, but soon Jews were not allowed to have bicycles anymore. We had to turn them in. I gave mine to a non-Jewish friend. I wasn't about to give my bicycle to the Nazis. And from then on, when we were not allowed to use the streetcar, I had to walk to school, which is 2.5 miles. It wasn't too bad, except in pouring rain. It got kind of miserable. In June of 1942, the Nazis started implementing the final solution. The first thing that was that they sent a notice to report for work in Germany to 2,000 German Jewish kids in Amsterdam. The reason why they sent it to German Jewish kids was because they felt there would be less resistance from the Dutch population in general. And they were correct in that. My brother got that call. I mean, there was, it stated here where you had to report and what you had to bring along. And like I say, my brother got that call. So did the older sister of Anne Frank, Margot Frank. And that's when the Frank family went into hiding. 2 young women who lived with us also got that call. And my mother advised them strongly not to go, but they were adults, and one of them actually had gotten married very recently. And they reported for, as requested, and the husband of the one young lady actually took tennis rackets and sunglasses along with the assumption that he would be able to play tennis after work. My mother was just shaking her head. My mother, in the meantime, decided that my brother was not going to go, and she managed to get a job for him. Hi, Mom. Without her, I wouldn't have made it. This is an ID that everybody older than 6 years had to carry, and Jewish people had to have the J in their ID, and every man had to add the name Isaac to their name, Israel, and every woman had to add the name Sarah. So my IDs was Hans Herbert Israel Angress and so on. But my mother managed to get a job for my brother at the Jewish Council. Now, the Jewish Council was an organization that was mandated to be an intermediary between the German government and the Jewish people. So all the edicts came down from the Nazi leadership. But that gave us, until further notice, we were exempt from work in Germany. And that only, not he got that, but my mother and me also. the people that responded to the call no. Well, this is where they were sent to the concentration camp Mauthausen, where they basically were worked to death. And of the 2,000 young people, I don't know exactly how many responded, but each and every one of those that responded to work on Germany the families received death notices, and that should have been a wake-up call. There was not a single survivor after 5 months of the first bunch that was called. And to my mind, this was the only time that the Nazis sent death notices to family members. My mother read the Nazis correctly. She was a survivor and did everything in her power to keep herself and her 2 boys out of the clutches of the Nazis. Unfortunately, she was an exception. Her advice to her boys was, if the Nazis ever get a hold of you, run at the first opportunity. The worst that can happen to you is that they shoot you, and believe me, that is better than what you are going to find at the end of the train ride that they want to put you on. And how right she was. The Nazis came after us about a dozen times, and I will share with you some close escapes. How much time do I have? Pardon? How much? No, another hour. Oh, then I was mistaken. Then I like to put some other stuff in. While going to school, after the deportation started, I looked around every morning when we came to school, who was still there and who was not. I mean, my class started out as 23, and after a night when there were razzias, you could reasonably assume that your classmate was picked up and along with their family. Now, if there were no razzias the evening before, you could hope that they actually went into hiding. So my class of 23 dwindled down to nothing during the 2-year period. You can imagine what it is when you come to class every morning looking around, who is still there and who is not. And as I mentioned earlier, half of my class survived. None of those that were picked up survived. All those that did survive, survived in hiding. My brother's job at the Jewish Council initially was to go along with the SS to pick up his fellow Jews, to help carry luggage or of people that were too old to carry it, or to help carry babies, and also to have a friendly face along, so that it would be easier for the Nazis to pick up their target. You can imagine that was not easy for them. But my mother told him, you have to do that because that buys us time, not only him. And to this day, he still suffers from that. Initially, they held their raids and put people on a streetcar to the station and hauled them off to a concentration camp in the western part of Europe, of Holland, called Westerbork, and from there they were shipped off to the death camps in Poland and Eastern Germany. But when that became too cumbersome to every night to have to transport Jews to the eastern part of Holland, they decided to collect them for a week in a theater that was converted to a holding pen. It was about as big as this hall. And so for a period of 1 week, the Nazis hauled their prey into that theater, and the Jewish council kids were there to help people with whatever they needed. They did all the administration. They checked people in and checked people out. And the babies were kept across the street in the nursery because they were deemed to be too much of a problem in the big open theater. Now, a bunch of the kids of the Jewish Council decided to try to save as many people as they could. So when there were babies across the street, they approached the parents in the theater and asked them, "Are you willing to give up your kid so that we can take it to a home of a Christian family who will shelter it from the Nazis?" And you can imagine what kind of a decision that was for those parents. But fortunately, many of them said, "Yes, go ahead, do it." And it were mainly Dutch students, university students, who did that work. So they went over to the nursery and picked up the kids and found homes for them. As a matter of fact, I found the homes first and then picked up the kids to bring them there. And of course, when the time came for the people to be shipped out of the theater, the count had to be right. So the mothers of babies that were shipped out were told how to make a bundle that looked like there was a baby in it when in fact there wasn't. And so the count came out that way. But they also tried to smuggle out adults. And as a matter of fact, when SS men knew they were doing it and turned his back when that happened. So actually there also were some decent SS men. When he died, some of the people that he saved wrote a very sweet obituary for him. But when they smuggled out adults, again the count had to be right. But it was a Jewish kid that was counting. I mean, there were a couple of SS people supervising everything, but all the work was done by the Jewish kids. So the kid that had to do the counting was informed how many were smuggled out. And so when there were 10 people smuggled out, he went 68, 69, 80, 81. He just skipped the 10 or whatever amount, and he did counting rather fast and was never caught at it. And one reason he was never caught at it is because Jews were deemed to be cowards and not dare to do things like that. So the Nazis didn't even watch out for something like that happening. So you have to sort of weigh it. On the one hand, my brother went along with the Nazis to pick up his fellow Jews. On the other hand, he and the group of, there were about 6 of them under the leadership of Walter Süskind. They smuggled out probably close to 1,000 babies and 600 adults. So during a 2-year period. And again, they were never caught at it. Coming back to, I will share with you now a couple of close escapes that we have had. One day, the Germans decided to have the razzia of the Clio Street. We lived in the Clio Street, which was a small street with 2 streets teeing into it. And they just blocked all the exits and went from house to house to see whether they could find Jews. And I was home, and my mother was home, and a friend of my mother, who was a fairly heavy-set guy, I was watching what was happening and was standing behind the curtains here. And in those days, we had much heavier curtains than you can see there right now. I could look out from behind the curtains, but you couldn't look in from the outside. And so we lived sort of in the middle of the block, and I watched the SS men coming closer and closer. And finally, the SS guy stood here where I am standing in 1993, ringing the doorbell. And I was standing behind the curtain, and it was like staring death into its face. I knew if that guy got a hold of me, that probably would be the end of me. And I remembered my mother saying, if they ever get close to you, run. Now this was the one time my mother sort of hesitated. Her friend was there, and I decided, when I saw this guy, I'm going to run. And I grabbed my mother's hand, and I didn't know whether she would come along with me or not. But fortunately, she decided to come along and leave her friend behind, because he would not have been able to go out the back porch, run, climb over the wall here, go across, climb over another wall, like my mother and I did, and disappear in the apartment across the street of people that we knew. Fortunately, their back door was open. Now, less than a minute later, the SS men that rang our doorbell appeared on our neighbor's back porch and entered our apartment through the back door. Now, they found only the friend of my mother. I think he was prepared for such an event and had carried a lot of cash with him. And he also had a medal from the First World War, and he somehow talked him, leaving him behind. Of course, if all 3 of us would have been there, that couldn't have happened, because there would have been witnesses, and that would have. He survived that way. But I'm sure if they would have found the 3 of us, all 3 of us would have been taken. And this was the only time that I actually took action. And these were 2 minutes of my life that I probably saved my mother's and my life. The rest of the time, the decisions were made for me. Another time, since my brother worked for the Jewish Council, he usually knew when there was a lot of SS activity and razzia was likely. And one day there was an awful lot of activity, and even though we had the stamp in our in our ID, that really didn't give you 100% certainty that they wouldn't take you. One day, for instance, a gentleman was arrested and ready to be shipped out, and he said, but I am not a Jew. And the SS-man that looked into his face said, whoever is a Jew, I determine. And that was the end of that. So you could not rely on that stamp. And so my brother told us, why don't you come to our office? I probably will leave that alone instead of staying home, and they might catch you there. Well, as it turned out, I mean, we went there, and as it turned out, the Nazis did come into the office. And as soon as I came in, my brother, who was wearing a white armband, and identified him as one of the Jewish council, but he was busy, and he asked a couple of his buddies to take me upstairs into an attic room and to put a chair on a table, and there was a trapdoor into the attic. And so I climbed up on the table and the chairs, opened the trapdoor, pulled myself up, closed the trapdoor, that took the table and the chair away, I assume. And well, this attic had only ceiling beams. It did not really have a floor. So there were the beams and the glass and plaster ceiling down below. They didn't have any sheetrock in those days. I got the scare of my life, and the trapdoor opened, but fortunately only another kid came up to join me up there. Now, while I was up there, nature called. And lath and plaster ceiling is rather porous. And I didn't want to lose my life. I can just see the SS-men looking up at the ceiling. Oh, what have we got there? And looked around, and fortunately I found an empty wine bottle. And it might be still up there, vintage of 1943. Sometimes an empty wine bottle comes in handy. While I was up there, I was sweating it out. I mean, I knew the SS was down there, and my brother and my mother. What happened down below, they rounded up all the people they could find, all the Jewish people, and put them in one large room. And then they got the list of the people who were actually working there. And they started calling off names. And my brother, because he had his white armband, and which identified him as somebody from the Jewish Council, he slipped out of the room. He claimed he had to do something and let him go. And so when they started calling off the names, and the name Angress was called, my mother slipped across. And fortunately, nobody of the other employees there said, oh, but she doesn't work here. So you had to be fast on your feet. I mean, my mother and my brother could not communicate, but somehow they did communicate how to try to solve that problem that day. So yeah, while I was up there, I was also contemplating, what am I going to do if they are going to take my brother and my mother, which was a real possibility. And I knew where they would be taken, and I was wondering, should I join them? And I knew that my mother would be absolutely furious if I did that. So I had decided that if that would be the case, that I would approach some non-Jewish Dutch friends that I had, or friends of my mother basically, and I was reasonably sure that they would help me. Fortunately, that wasn't necessary at that point. So these were some of the closest calls. There were other times, there were about a dozen times that we actually left our home because there was some activity and we did not want to be caught at home. And quite often we were sheltered by German non-Jewish women, believe it or not. I'll come back to that later. In September of 1943, until further notice came to an end. At that time, there were only a very few Jewish people left in Holland. There were originally 140,000 Jews in Holland, out of which 28,000 went into hiding. Of those that went into hiding, about 16,000 survived, so better than half. Of the 105,000 that did not go into hiding, only 5,000 survived. So obviously your chances of survival was much greater than if you did not go into hiding. The Germans always told you, if we catch you in hiding, things will be much worse for you than if you cooperate with us. And unfortunately, the Jewish leadership also gave that advice. But like I say, my mother, obviously, she knew the Germans well and always was prepared to do whatever she felt necessary. Initially, all the Jews in Holland had to move to Amsterdam. Then later on in Amsterdam, when it took them about 2 years to basically transport all the Jewish people from Amsterdam into concentration camp, or they went into hiding. By the September 1943, there were about 2,000 Jews living in one section of Amsterdam where people were forced to concentrate in sort of a ghetto. And my brother came home from work and said, it looks like they're going to round up the remaining few Jews still living in Amsterdam. And that's when my mother decided to go into hiding. Actually, I tried to encourage her to go into hiding. I didn't really know. She did not share these, what kind of preparation she had made for me, but I assumed that she had. And when we had to move from the Clio Street into the ghetto area, I told her, why don't we go into hiding right now? Our furniture gets loaded, and that way we can just have it stored somewhere and go into hiding. But my mother was not ready at that point. But when my brother came home that night and said, you know, tonight it's going to be the few Jews that are left in Amsterdam, my mother ordered a taxi. We, of course, took this jam off and packed another clean set of clothes and some toiletries. She managed to get a taxi. That in itself was a miracle because there were only 2 taxis in Amsterdam. There was hardly any gasoline for taxis. How she managed that is beyond me. But we were driven to a apartment fairly near the Clio Street where we used to live. And there was a German lady who used part of her apartment as a sweatshop, where there were lots of sewing machines and bags of fur. And in daytime, there were women making gloves and caps for the German soldiers out of fur on the Eastern Front. And the lady, and I don't know who she was, locked us into that room with those sewing machines, gave us a potty and a bottle of water, and told us we had to be absolutely quiet because that evening her boyfriend was going to visit her, and she told us that he was a Nazi. So here you had the idiotic situation where a German non-Jewish woman was hiding 3 Jews, and she had a Nazi boyfriend. You can imagine that we were very quiet that night. And the next morning we left there after her boyfriend had left and split up and did not see each other again for the next 18 months. At that point, the Dutch resistance movement had sort of taken charge of us. One of our neighbors, which I only found out much later, was involved in that. Initially, I stayed with again a German non-Jewish woman who was a former associate with my father in the banking business. And she lived in a boarding house in a studio apartment. So I stayed with her, and of course that was not a situation where I could stay any length of time. I was 15 years old to share a room with this lady in her studio. But that was the only place we had at the time while they were looking for a permanent place for me. And after a couple of weeks, I was told they had found one, and this is where I ended up. A gentleman by the name of Ton Kui came to pick me up. And he had a wife, Alida, and two boys, Walter and Peter. They lived, so he picked me up that evening and we marched across Amsterdam. They lived way on the western end of the city. Actually, you could look, when you looked out the back windows, you looked out over open land and the train tracks, and it was really at the very end of Amsterdam. And this is where the apartment where I spent a year and a half. Once I was in hiding, my feelings changed completely. The Koi family was very heavily involved in other activities fighting the Nazis. They were part of the Dutch resistance movement. Well, again, the Dutch resistance movement was not one organization. There were the communists and the socialists and the Protestants and the Catholics. Each had their own group, but they all worked together, at least until a few months before the end of the war, when they all started jockeying for position for power after the war. But during the war with the common enemy, they worked together. And part of the things they were involved in were feeding the people that were in hiding. You know, going into hiding, it sounds like a simple decision, but it wasn't. To begin with, you had to be willing to take that risk because everybody told you if you were caught in hiding that things would be worse for you than otherwise. Now that turned out not to be true. As a matter of fact, I only read recently that the greater proportion of people that were caught in hiding survived than people that went not into hiding. So even if you were caught in hiding, your chances were better for survival. And I have a theory about that. If you were caught in hiding, you were deemed a criminal. And the criminal was still a human being, but a Jew was just but a Jew. And I don't know whether that theory is correct, but I was surprised to hear that a larger percentage of people that went into hiding and were caught survived. So the Dutch resistance movement did all sorts of things. The main thing is to feed the people in hiding. I mean, once you had made the decision that you want to go into hiding, you had to find somebody who was willing to risk their life to shelter yours. I mean, you know, if you were willing to risk your life to shelter somebody else from a really unknown danger, that is a hero. And how many of us are heroes? Then once you hiding, food was very scarce, and you could buy food only, you could acquire food only with money and coupons. Everything was rationed. And the rations were not very generous. They were just enough for you to survive. And so if you took somebody in, then either you had to share your meager rations, or you had to get a hold of ration books for these people in hiding. And it were not only Jewish people in hiding, as a matter of fact, they were the minority. The majority of people in hiding were young Dutch people, young Dutch men, who were ordered to work in Germany because all Dutch young Germans were in the army, and so they were short of labor. And of course the Dutch young people didn't want to go to Germany, so there were, well, there were estimated 28,000 Jews in hiding in Holland. There were at least 100,000 Dutch young men in hiding. And all of these had to be supplied with coupons, because otherwise you had to buy them food on the black market. And that cost at least 10 times as much as normal. For instance, a pound of butter was the equivalent of $60. So unless you were wealthy, you really couldn't go into hiding. So one of the things the Dutch underground did is get a hold of 100 or 150,000 coupons each month. And in order to that, you had to have weapons to overwhelm a distribution center. And in Holland, there were not very many weapons around, so you had to haul the weapons that you used for these raids from one place to another. You couldn't raid the same place over and over again, not even in the same city. And the father of Mrs. Cooey, he was a very sweet, short, retired merchant marine with a sweet smile and very light blue eyes. And he said, you know, let me do the more dangerous stuff and haul those weapons to where they are needed. And one day he had a satchel, and in it he had the pistol that had to be hauled to another city and the ammunition necessary. And guess what? The Nazis came through the train to look at everybody's luggage. They really didn't expect to find guns and ammunition. What they were looking for was butter and cheese and milk, and which people illegally bought directly from farmers to supplement their rations. That was forbidden, and so they were trying to confiscate what people had gathered out in the country. So finally they came to Grandpa Larroux and asked him, well, Grandpa, what have you got in your satchel? And he looks up at them with his sweet eyes and says, guns and ammunition. And they just look at him and said, oh, you joker. And they never opened the satchel. Why not? He was trained to do that. The last thing the Nazis wanted to do was look ridiculous. And they were afraid if he opened the satchels, out would stop his long johns and his PJs and his toothbrush, and everybody would be laughing, and they were not willing to take that chance. I mean, you call that psychological warfare, and Grandpa Larroux won. And he survived, and he kept on doing that. The Cooey family, there was a 2-bedroom home, and I shared the room for the 2 kids. Now the room, it was a long, narrow room which had there was only space for 2 single, narrow beds. So those 2 boys, during the 18 months, they were 4 and 6 years old when I got there, had to share one narrow, fairly small bed for 18 months. So not only did they risk their life, But it was a very difficult time for those two boys sleeping in one bed for all that length of time. And I'm sure that was not easy for them. So once the underground got a hold of the coupons, then they had to be distributed. And one of my jobs was to cut up those coupons. They came in large sheets, and each month you got a new large sheet, and there was a master book. Then every time you pick up one of those sheets, a stamp gets put into your master book that you got your monthly sheet. And it had sheets for butter and cheese and bread and sugar and you name what. And also for clothing. And for clothing you had to, you did not get, it took you a long time to get enough coupons to buy a pair of pants or a pair of shoes. So one of my jobs was to cut these sheets apart into their different categories, all the bread coupons and all the sugar coupons, and again paste them on large sheets, which then they could give to grocers who then could supply people in hiding with food at reasonable prices. There were two ways of doing it. One way was to give grocers a whole sheet and get a bunch of loaves and then distribute that. And otherwise they distributed to the people in hiding and they could use the card that way. It really depended on the hiding situation. Each hiding situation was different. I kept myself busy. Fortunately, the Cui family had a good library, so I did a lot of reading. I helped in cleaning house and also kept myself busy with making little flags, 1/2 inch by 1 inch. American flags, for instance, it had the 13 stripes and the blue square with 48 white dots on it, all on that little thing on both sides. Took me many hours to make the things. And of course we listened, we were not allowed to listen, but we listened to the BBC, to the Dutch broadcast. And so we knew what was going on, and we knew how many American divisions there were and how many British divisions and how many Russian divisions. And so I made a flag for each division of all those countries, and I had a flag for the Brazilian brigade and for the Jewish brigade. And we had a big map of Europe and followed the retreat of the Germans on the wall. Of course, I was instructed if somebody ever rang the bell and we looked out and saw that there was a Nazi down there, I was supposed to swipe those flags off the map of Europe and get rid of them in a hurry. But I had a lot of fun doing it. And the Cui house was really, they also gathered information for the Allies. They also tried to, when a plane got shot down and people bailed out, the Dutch underground tried to get to them before the Germans did. And I remember one day when a plane was shot down, the crew bailed out, and I watched in horror as the Germans were shooting at the parachutes coming down. I could see the holes appearing in the parachutes. Fortunately, they did not manage to shoot the people. And later on, I found out that half of them there were about, I think, 7 that bailed out. The Dutch underground got a hold of half of them, and the Germans of the other half. And again, the Dutch underground had ways of getting these people. through France and Portugal back to England to fly another day. Sometimes one also got a hold of, for instance, the whole cheese and then divided that and distributed to people in hiding. My estimate is that of the Dutch population, 3 or 5% actually cooperated with the Nazis. They became Nazis. And some of them were even Nazis before the Germans came in. And 3 or 5% were the Dutch resistance movement. And the rest were what we call bystanders. And nowadays we sort of put a negative connotation on bystanders, but I see bystanders as most of us. I mean, in order not to be a bystander, you almost had to be a hero. And again, how many of us are? Like, for instance, here, the Khois were probably the only ones in this apartment building that were actively fighting the Nazis. But all the others, I'm sure, knew, they didn't believe the story that we told them that I was an orphan from Rotterdam. To begin with, I had a German accent. And, but they were bystanders, and they didn't betray me, and so I'm grateful for that. So I do not buy the negative connotation of bystanders of not being good people. They are, but they are not heroes. Okay. I got a new identity. The Dutch took the your ID. There were two ways of getting your new ID. One is to get a brand new ID, and they had ways of getting that. They again raided the distribution center where they had a bunch of IDs and fixed one up for you. And another one is to take your ID and alter it. And in my case, they altered it. They had some real good artists doing this kind of work. They started out by taking out the J. They changed my name from Angress to Andreas, so they had to only change 2 letters. But then they had to change my birthplace from Berlin to Rotterdam. And like I say, many people in hiding had Rotterdam addresses, because when the Germans invaded Holland, they bombed the living daylight out of Rotterdam civic center and destroyed the civic center. And so it was difficult to trace people in Rotterdam. So many people in hiding had Rotterdam addresses. By the way, they bombed Rotterdam after Holland already had surrendered. But again, that is neither here nor there. They pumped into me, but my name now is Hans Andreas. And sometimes they woke me up in the middle of the night, what's your name? And I better said Hans Andreas. Just in case some Germans ever did raid, that I would be betrayed, and they would check that my name and my ID would match. Also, while I was in hiding, they provided a hiding place for me underneath the dining room table, that in case somebody ever rang the bell down below, that I could slip away between the ceiling joists from the apartments down below. And they put a smooth board over the ceiling lath, so that when I go in there, that I wouldn't end up on the dining room table of the lady below. and also that it would be easier to slip in there. And one day we did a test, how fast could I go in there? So one of the Kui boys went down and rang the bell, and then I went into action and pulled the carpet back and took the trapdoor out and slipped in, and Mrs. Kui put the trapdoor back on and put the carpet over it and the table on top of that. And they wanted to see how long I would be able to last down there. They gave me a bottle of water and said, in case I had to cough. And I got bored down there, and I found I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a bolt, and I started twirling it. And the next day, the lady from down below here came up and rang the bell and said, Mrs. Kui, the strangest thing happened last night. I was sitting in my living room, and there was that hanging plant, and all of a sudden it started twirling and twirling and twirling. I had a hold of a hanging plant. And the message was, of course, you better be careful. Towards the end of the war, since I had good papers, I couldn't go to school because in Dutch I had as much of an accent I have in English, so my birthplace, Rotterdam, and my accent didn't match. But I was old enough that I didn't have to go to school. But I could go out on the street, and if a German would stop me, I probably could get by. If a Dutchman would stop me, I would have to be very careful with opening my mouth. But fortunately, I was never stopped. But towards the end of the war, they allowed me to help distribute coupons to other people in hiding. And one day they gave me a whole wheel of cheese in a bag, which again was supposed to be distributed to people in hiding. And so I took that wheel of cheese and brought it to an address and delivered it. And again, I was instructed how to get there. I was never given an address, and I was not allowed to look at address. They told me you take this street, and then you turn right, and you never look at either the name of the street or the number. But they told me exactly what to do. And then when I rang the bell, there was a password that had to be passed back and forth. Just in case I ever got caught, the Germans use torture to get information out, and you don't know how much torture you can withstand. So what you don't know, you can't spill. So when I delivered things, I was always very careful to follow these rules, because I also knew I didn't want to know who these people were I delivered things to. But okay, I delivered that piece of cheese and was on my way home when I ran into my former Boy Scout leader, and Cub Scout leader actually. And I knew she had turned Nazi. So here we all of a sudden, when I noticed her, it was too late. She had noticed me too. So here we were face to face, and I decided to take the bull by the horn. And I only knew her by the name of Bajira. The Dutch Cub Scouts were based on the Jungle Book from Rudyard Kipling, where the leader was the wolf, the gray wolf, Akela, and Bajira was the Black Panther, and Baloo was the bear. And so we had two women leaders, Akela and Bajira, and Baloo was a man. And I ran into Bajira, and Akela and Bajira both turned Nazi. And I didn't tell her that I knew that she was Nazi, but I just told her, hello, Bajira, and I guess you realize that I'm in hiding, and I hope you won't tell anybody. And she said, of course not. And she we chatted for a while, and then we parted ways, and I was darn sure that I didn't go straight home and wouldn't be followed. But it was a scary moment there to be in hiding and run into a Nazi lady. Let's see what's next. Well, this is Mr. Kui, the gentleman that picked me up and took me to the hiding place. This is a couple, many, many years later, after they came to the United States. I helped them to come here. And they lived in Danville for many years, and they're now passed away. Oh, these were coupons that I pasted and cut. This is just a picture. Amsterdam was on the flight path to Berlin. And it is, Anne Frank in her book said she was afraid of those planes coming over. For me, it was music to my ears. I knew that my future depended on these guys being successful. And they came over in waves of hundreds, and then there was a pause, and then there came another 100, and there was a pause. And it was just amazing to see that. And of course, the Germans tried to shoot them down, and occasionally they hit one. One day, actually, there was one. I didn't see it being hit, but there was a plane coming. I was home alone, standing in front of the window, and all of a sudden, one of those planes came sailing right for me with the motors dead. And I was contemplating, should I go run away? And I said, you know, if I run away, it might hit there. I might as well stay here. The chances are the same. And I just watched the plane coming, and then it finally veered off and crashed in a street. Fortunately, it killed one street vendor, but it didn't hit a house. This is a cooking contraption. The last winter in Holland, we did not have any gas or electricity, and it was a miserably cold winter. It was really freezing cold. So we had, in order to prepare food, you put a quart can, fix the quart can in a gallon can, and put that on a regular little stove. And the stove had the open top. And you made a little fire in that quart can. You didn't have much wood either available. And you prepared your meals that way. And yes, this was my mother's doing. She was in hiding in the boarding house where we lived for a few months before we moved, when we first came to Holland, before we moved into an apartment. And the boarding house was taken over by German military officers, not SS, but of military. And she lived in one of these attic rooms and went by her maiden name, Henny Kiefer, and paraded as a maid. And she cleaned their rooms and made their beds, and then she went out once a week to have her fingernails done and her hair done. I mean, my mom had her priorities, and which of course also helped. The more normal you acted, the less you are suspected to be in hiding. And so that's how she survived as Henny Kiefer, the maid. I mean, I always had mixed feelings about my mother. I mean, basically, I was raised by a maid. My mother was not a warm, fuzzy mother, but by golly, I wouldn't have survived without her. And the older I get, the more I appreciate her. Had she been warm and fuzzy, I might not have made it. the war in Holland, in the northern part of Holland, simply ended. We were never liberated. There was no fighting in Amsterdam. When the Allied did not succeed in to conquer the bridge too far, the bridge over the Rhine River at Arnhem, they decided to leave the northern part of Holland alone and go straight for Berlin. So all of a sudden the war was over, the Germans were still there, there were no Allied. But I went out into the streets and felt reasonably safe. And a few days after the war had ended, I was told that the Canadians would come to take over the management of the city until the Dutch could get their act together and take care of themselves again. And I wanted to see those guys come in. I wanted some kind of closure. And the Kuis were busy with something else, and I said, okay, you go ahead. So I went to the route where they were expected, and there were, of course, thousands of people, and it took a long time, and finally I saw something approaching, and leading the parade was a tall, good-looking black dude on a Harley Davidson. And with the biggest smile on his face you can imagine. And to this day, my symbol of freedom is this dude on his Harley. And behind him we had miles and miles of all kinds of trucks with supplies. But when I saw him, I knew, yes, the war indeed was over. A few days later, on Mother's Day, actually 1945, my brother showed up. His commanding general, Slim Jim Gavin, had given him a jeep and an indefinite pass, together with another soldier who had family in Holland, and told him, you go look for your family. And so he showed up on Mother's Day and went to the Kleiostraat 39, the last address. He knew where we had lived, and of course my mother informed those people that were living there that somebody might show up looking for us, both either my father or my brother. And so we were reunited on that day. My mother looks rather, she was healthy but thinner than a rail at that point. My father did not return. He was ultimately sent to Auschwitz after he served a sentence. And we got my brother, who was a historian, got a hold of his death certificate, which was not meant for the family, but and he only got a hold of that after the war with the Russians came down, because the information was over there, and found out that, the death certificate stated that my father died of sudden heart stoppage. And that language was strange to me. I mean, why didn't they say heart attack? And then my brother got a hold of the actual, that is the information we got from the Red Cross. And the German death certificate stated the same in German. And the thing was signed by Dr. Bruno Kett. And a few years ago, I decided to Google Dr. Bruno Kett. And I found out that he was a when he studied to be a doctor, he had to join either the SA or the SS, and decided to join the SS because they had their gatherings in his town and the SA in another town, and he didn't want to travel. So when war broke out and he had become a doctor, he was assigned to Auschwitz. And he was initially in charge of the women's hospital in Auschwitz, but also Auschwitz was not necessarily an extermination camp, even though more Jews died in Auschwitz than anywhere else, but was also a work camp. And one of Dr. Kitt's jobs was to decide if somebody who was a worker, who was too sick or too frail to continue working. Then his job was to take care, to decide this person had to die, and was summoned to his office. And then there were two orderlies who injected phenol directly into the heart. And so I now know exactly, I actually know to the minute when my father died and how he died. My only consolation is that it probably was an easier death than dying in a gas chamber and gasping for air for 15 minutes. So Dr. Kitt again is one of those examples how he probably would, if it wouldn't have been for Hitler, he probably would have been a good doctor, and he was a Catholic. He married in a Catholic service and had a baby, and it was baptized. And, and I wondered how his wife, Kate, and his kid felt. I mean, Dr. Kitt, finally, after the war, he was sentenced to death. Interesting enough, not what he did in Auschwitz, but when Auschwitz was closed, when the Russians came to close, and he was in Neuengamme near Hamburg for the last 2 months. And during the last 2 months, he committed enough atrocities that he was sentenced to death. And while Auschwitz came, I have the whole trial notes actually. While Auschwitz was mentioned, he claimed that he was an SS doctor in Auschwitz. Well, he signed my father's death certificate, and my father was not an SS man. So that was a lie. But, well, he was executed, and which doesn't give me any particular joy either, quite frankly. I don't believe in the death sentence. And you have to wonder about somebody like Dr. Kitt. Did he simply consider himself a good soldier? Did he realize what he did was evil? I don't know. I mean, my feeling is if it wouldn't have been for Hitler, he might have been a perfectly decent human being. Now that the war was over, I found myself on my own at age 17. My mother was in no position to support me, and I did not see much of a future for me in Holland. And when my brother, Tom, who was an American citizen, offered to help my brother Fred and me to come to the United States, we jumped to that at that opportunity, and I arrived in the United States in late 1947 with $25 in my pocket. I first finished high school in a private school which was run by a friend of my brother in Lenox, Massachusetts. I had to fake a little bit in order to get it. Actually, I had only 8 regular school years. but I had enough courses, but I didn't. What I didn't disclose is many of those courses I had only once or twice a week, so it somehow added up, and I ended up with a high school diploma. When I finished that, I, for some reason, wanted to be a dairyman. That's again a whole other story. My father, agriculture was not in my family's background. My oldest brother was trained as a farmer, but he ended up as a history professor, and I ended up as a farmer. I started working on a farm in Massachusetts. And then a friend, I became aware of an opportunity that some dairyman on Tomales Bay in Marin County was looking for somebody to join him in running a dairy, and so I jumped at that opportunity and came west and became a dairyman for 20 years. And after that, afterwards I became a real estate salesman. I didn't like that and became a property management, and then now I'm retired. So I think in order to leave some time for questions, I will leave it at this. Thank you. Question? Yeah.
When you were in hiding, did you have any idea how many Jews were actually being killed?
No, not. I only learned that after the war, really. Yeah. Yeah.
In my class, we were talking a lot about the Nuremberg trials, and I just wanted to know your opinion on how you felt the way that played out. Do you think that was justifiable, what they did executing all those Nazi leaders, or do you think that should have been handled differently?
I'm a little hard of hearing. I didn't.
So in my class, we were talking a lot about the Nuremberg trials.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know your personal opinion on how you felt, how they ended up executing the leaders of that. You felt that was justifiable for them to do that, or do you think that it should have been handled differently?
Well, again, I personally don't believe in the death sentence. And yes, the leaders were killed, and so many others who did. Many of them, Nazis, became again leaders in Germany. It was not really possible to deal with this whole situation in that people could get justice. There were just too many people involved in too many different things, and I never had any strong feelings one way or the other. Would have been interesting to see Hitler on trial, but he decided he didn't want to and kill himself. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for us based on your experiences?
Well, primarily to be aware of what's happening in the world. Like I started out saying, the same conditions that existed in Germany exist in many other countries in this world, and as the world population grows, my main advice is basically to be tolerant, to recognize differences as an asset rather than, I mean, if we would be all the same, how boring life would be. And we have to share this planet and we have to take care of it. We are lousy stewards of this world. I mean, there's so much to be done. And some of you will be politicians in the future. And for heaven's sake, I hope that you are going to do something rather and compromise rather than take the attitude that our politicians at this point do. It's my way or the highway, and so nothing gets done. I mean, we're living in difficult times and it's not getting any easier. The problem is getting bigger and the population is getting bigger. And all that leads to more conflict and the possibility for another genocide. I think at this point, I think another genocide is more likely than not likely. I mean, I always like to end up with what, what can you do as an individual? I mean, just Arthur Ashe put it that way. The tennis player, start where you are now, use what you have and do what you can. And it may not be much and it may not, maybe little things, but be helpful to other people. And yeah.
If you were given the opportunity to speak face to face with a Nazi perpetrator, what would you want to say to them?
I would try to find out how he felt about himself at this point. I'm not going to give him any lecture. I would find that useless, but I mean, there are some Jewish people that have done that have tried to connect with Nazis and find out, what made you do, what caused you to do this. And like I say, there are so many decent people that did the terrible things. Yes.
In your years of anti-death sentence, did you ever take part in the protests from San Quentin when they had
Yeah, no, I didn't. It's just a personal. I think a life is a life, and quite frankly, I think life in prison without a possibility of parole is a bigger punishment than death, and human life should be cherished regardless.
You said that you thought most people would be bystanders,
Yeah.
not heroes. And then you talked a lot about the
Goys.
Yeah. What do you think made them special? What was it that you think in your 18 months there and observing them made them want to risk their lives and made them different?
They were strong, they were very active young socialists, and many of that group became resistors. They were usually young, active in political life or religious life. And if I ever dared say that they were heroes, I said, no, we just did what human beings should do. They didn't consider themselves. And most people that were resistors did not consider themselves heroes. Yeah.
I have a question, but I just want to share something that, of course, I told you. And that's that my mother was a Dutch Jew, and much of her family was actually deported to their death through that theater, the Hollandaise Shoulder. So that's a very strong connection. And in that context, something I read once, and I wish I could
Yeah.
than the people who didn't. And in that context, I'm curious, when you say 5% of the people were heroes, but they didn't consider themselves heroes, what would constitute being a hero when we look at the potential for more Holocausts of different peoples today?
I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you. I don't know.
Okay, that's very important.
You know, I really don't. It would be presumptuous for me to come up with something.
To me, that's an important question.
Yeah, I mean,
What is
it,
agency?
all I can do is try to ask people to be aware and be tolerant of each other. Yeah.
How many times have you been back to either Germany or Holland, and how do you feel when you go there?
Well, the first time was rough when I went back to Germany. I didn't want to go back to Germany, but it was the German cities invite people who have been born there and lived there and had to leave the country. They invited those people to visit the city, and I got that invitation, and I didn't want to go. And my wife Inola, who is back there, encouraged me and also told me, you want to visit Holland anyhow, so why don't you? They pay the whole trip, and not only for me but for my wife too. They treated us royally, so I went back. But then, you know, we went down memory lane and visited the places where I lived. And one day, for instance, we went into an apartment store, and it was very busy, and I heard all that German language around me, and I just freaked out. And I told my wife, Inola, let's get the hell out of here. Later on, my brother, whom I talked about, after he finished his career as a history professor here in the United States, he actually went back to Berlin, and he did much of good work there. So I visited him, and it became easier as time went on. And of course, in Holland, I mainly remembered the good things that happened to me in Holland. I mean, but the first time back to Germany was rough.
Hans, thank you again for coming.
Thank you.